I'm here today with Mako Fujimura. Mako is a leading contemporary artist whose process-driven refractive slow art has been described by David Brooks of the New York Times as a small rebellion against the quickening of time. Mako's art has been featured widely in galleries and museums around the world and is collected by notable collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, the Huntington Library, as well as Tikutin Museum in Israel. His art has been exhibited at various venues, including Dillon Gallery in New York, Saito Museum in Tokyo, the Tokyo National University of Fine Arts Museum, Bentley Gallery in Arizona, and many others. Mako is also an accomplished writer, and I want to talk with him here in a moment about two of his books that he's already published, in addition to the new one that's coming out tomorrow. And so, in addition, I can say that Mako is an entrepreneur. He's a friend, and he's spoken at several of our Writing for Your Life and Publishing in Color events previously. So, Mako, it's wonderful to be here together with you and to be able to talk about your work and your new book.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's wonderful to be here as well.
Well, as I kind of indicated, Mako and I have known each other for several years, and I've really enjoyed collaborating with him on multiple levels. And maybe, Mako, besides kind of the stuff I said in the introduction, maybe you could give a little bit more deeper flavor for folks as to your journey leading up to today.
Yeah, so I was born in Boston. My father was a leading acoustics and speech and hearing scientist. He was working with Noam Chomsky at MIT when I was born, and ended up after that in Sweden. My first visual memories of Sweden, and then to Japan, where I went to grade school in Japan, and then came back to U.S. My father was recruited by Bell Labs in Murray Hill, which was the best peer research facility in the world at the time. And I grew up in the world of sciences and scientists. And yet I always felt drawn to the arts. And when I went to college at Bucknell University, I realized that I was indeed an artist and I needed to try to make it as an artist. And I told my father this, and he said, well, that's great, because that's what I wanted to become. So I had quite a support from both of my parents, and which was very fortunate. So I never really expected to be a writer as well, even though my experience at Bucknell was I would be spending a lot of time in the art barn painting, and then I would try to write. At the time I was very much struggling with English language, and in fact, writing of any kind, any language, would have been difficult for me because of the bicultural upbringing and not really owning any one language, whether Japanese or English, or I was always a border stalker. And so after 9/11, I began to write these little essays on the airplane, advocating for the arts in the United States as a National Council on the Arts member, helping the chair of the National Endowment, Dana Gioia, a remarkable poet and a businessman, as you know, and I learned a lot from him. And in the days of heightened culture wars, which still continues today in a very toxic way, Dana was able to bring some of these very important arts initiatives to be funded by the government, but also partnering with companies like Boeing and other business industries, and to make arts more accessible, to empower writers coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Big Read, which is the biggest governmental program on reading ever done, and it still continues. And I was privileged to be part of those efforts. And so I was writing, and I thought, what do I call what Dana is doing in DC, in this divided, polarized place where arts are not welcome. But he managed to convince senators and House members, and President Laura Bush was very significant player in this, as she advocated for us constantly. Actually went out of her way to make sure that we had the support we needed. But to be able to bring the arts conversation as a poet into the place of debates, as Dana did very successfully, to have a conversation that is not about culture wars, but culture care. So I began to call that culture care, and learn from him. And so my next book was called Culture Care. And then I was invited to write in response to a script by a film that Martin Scorsese was working on called Silence, based on Shusaku Endo's masterpiece, post-war masterpiece of the same title, about Portuguese missionaries coming into Japan in 17th century, in a forbidden island where they knew that they would be martyred, or at least arrested and tortured. And the story of difficult journey of faith in a land where it was unlawful to be a Christian. And I spent much time thinking about that book, Silence, and Endo himself, and wrote a book called Silence and Beauty, reflecting on what I studied in Japan, which I did after Bucknell. I went to Tokyo University of Fine Arts to study traditional art form called Nihonga, which harkens back to 16th century Japan, and in a lineage program that allowed me to, as an outsider, I was the first outsider to be ever invited into the doctorate level lineage program. But I felt so connected with aesthetics of 16th century. So it was a privilege to do this for 6.5 years. So I knew something about the backdrop to the 17th century Japan that Endo writes about, and Martin Scorsese was trying to film. So I was able to help in a small way as a special advisor to the film. And then Silence Beauty became kind of this compendium of my thoughts about Japanese aesthetics and beauty and faith, as well as doubt, journey of darkness, trauma, and that brings us to present time, where my new book is coming out tomorrow out of Yale Press.
Yes, yeah. So thank you for that overview. As I said, Mako's an amazing person who has got strong skills in several different directions. And so the one book that he mentioned, Culture Care: Reconnecting with Beauty for Our Common Life, came out in 2017, and Silence and Beauty that Mako mentioned, that was associated with the Martin Scorsese movie, came out in 2016. And were those both InterVarsity Press?
Yes. Yes, those are both InterVarsity Press. Although Culture Care came out in 2010 originally. I self-published it through International Arts Movement. It was kind of an underground book that I gave it to leaders of Culture Care movement to help them understand the term and the history behind the term. And then Ivy Press printed it as a revamped book in 2016, I think. Yeah.
So there's a good example for those of you writers who are considering self-publishing. You can do that, and if it does well enough, you'll probably have a traditional publisher that will be interested in republishing it for you.
Well, that is true. That is something that has changed about publishing. People used to kind of poo-poo self-publishing before, but if you have an audience base, right, and if you could be useful to your audience, because in the case of culture care, I think we sold, 1,000 books right away because of the culture care movement. And these were not marketed. They were, really the leaders of the movement already all over the world who wanted to understand the history of culture care and how to think about it or how to talk about it. And I think we printed 3,000. I just found a box of the original.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, in my storage, which is the only one left. And there'll be like antique someday. But it's really precious. I have a friend who's a curator in Beijing. He's an artist, and he carried around with him wherever he went the original copy of Culture Care, which was in Vedam. I designed it myself. So
wow.
It's very nice, but it's very fragile. It was meant to, and so he had rips everywhere, and he kind of carefully, beautifully taped it up, and he carried it everywhere with him. And so probably that copy is probably the copy that I'm most proud of, right?
I guess, yeah, the most mileage and most wear, and, most countries, probably of any copy of the book.
That's right.
That's great. That's a good story.
Yeah.
So as we mentioned, tomorrow, which, as we're recording this is January 5th, Mako's new book called Art and Faith, A Theology of Making will be released from Yale Press.
Yeah.
And let me just read a couple of lines from the foreword that was written by N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright, yeah, Mako.
He says, Mako Fujimura is one of those rare artists with the ability to explain what he does, why he does it, and how his vocation makes sense within his larger worldview. This book opens a life-giving vista on the beauty and mercy of God and invites us to join in the feast. So, Mako, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, how this book came about and, what the nature of it is.
Yeah, so I call this my life work because this is a work that I really began to write when I was in my 20s, and I was starting to discover my faith, understanding who Jesus came to be in recorded through the New Testament, and I met Christ basically through literature. I studied Bucknell. I remember a class that I took by Dr. Michael Payne, who is a renowned Shakespearean and Blake scholar, taught a class called Bible and Literature. Not Bible as literature, Bible and literature. And so he said it would be quite impossible to understand Western literature without understanding the King James Bible. So I carried around King James Bible with me for a long time because that was all I knew about the Bible. But I learned the Gospel through William Blake and Shakespeare and Milton and so by the time I felt like this figure of Christ became very personal to me, I didn't really know that meant that I would become a Christian. I just knew that this seminal figure in history who has changed everything, how we view ourselves, how we view our culture, how we view, what hopes we will have for the future, is, fundamentally the only example, a very unique example in history where I thought love was manifested and purely and uniquely in how he spoke, how he lived his life, and how he died. And so I came to understand biblical narrative. And then I started to read the Bible, this time NIV rather than King James, but and every page seemed to me that it was speaking to me from the zone of creativity, imagination. This is the creator who, even gave us the idea that we can create, right? So even the notion that we can be creative, and we're created to be creative. And every page of the Bible is so much about, old creation fractured and new creation breaking in. And so, when you get caught up in churches, paradigm and programs, especially in parachurches and evangelical circles, I would always think that biblical passages spoke a much larger sense of reality, that it would, lens of creativity flowing through broken people, right? And God doesn't give up, continues to on and on speaks through the prophets and then through Jesus and then Paul and epistles and so forth. But it ends up in new creation, so, I didn't really understand why we're talking about the end times when I felt like as an artist, I could see the generative possibility of even the bleakest of times, even the darkest moments where we would think that it would be impossible. Well, that's when Jesus walks on water, and so these things that spoke to me as an artist, I kept to myself for a long time because I wanted to be faithful and to the church programs and so forth. And I even led in many of these efforts, but then come with culture care, right? This idea of advocating for artists and why do you do that? Why do you advocate for a modern dancer to receive funding for, governmental grants so that they can continue to dance, or they can at least have a place to practice their craft. And it came to me that all of a sudden I was writing one day in the airplane, and I said, why am I advocating for modern dancers? And it came to me that this is not about the arts only. It's really about the gospel. It's really about the promise of abundance that biblical narrative gives us, that no other paradigm can give us. Through the life and death of Jesus and resurrection, we have entered into this domain that is new creation. Anybody in Christ, we are new creation. And that means that there is something very powerful about the margins of expression that only human beings can create. And that's modern dance. That it doesn't make sense to a dying world or to a world that is caught up in Darwinian survival, fittest of survival. But it makes sense if there's abundance that we assume in the universe, that our bodies cry out to testify to. That's why we dance, right? Despite what we see, despite the challenges, despite the scarcity. So how do we see that? And then when I was writing Culture Care, I had these theological principles behind it. Every lecture that I gave in public, so this is not the churches, would have theological principles as the foundation that I don't talk about because I don't assume that people understand Christianese, But I wrote them down, and I had amassed about 3,000 pages of notes on scripture passages, and I try to kind of write a book that responded, and at the time I was having conversation with N.T. Wright, Dr. Ellen Davis at Duke, Miroslav Volf at Yale, about these things. I'm not a theologian, so I didn't know if I was crazy or not, right? and I every time I say bounce off an idea, many of which is in the book, they'll come back to me with, Mako, you're not only right, but this is fundamentally something that the modern theology has missed. You're tapping into. What you're saying is, you think you might be crazy because you're an artist, and you're saying these things, you see these things. No. This is the reality of the Bible. You need to write this. And so, that's excellent. Yeah. So I just, wrote out what it turned out to be 3 times the material that I have in the book, and try to compress it. And I worked with Kathy Helmers, who was my chief editor and agent, to make this work. And she did such a great job. She understood the
Kathy
whole.
is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, she's an amazing editor as well as an agent. But she, today, as you know, it's very hard to find good editors who go beyond just, editing for errors, but they see the whole, they help you to compress it in a cogent way without losing the whole, right? And that's what she did. We went back and forth many times trying to figure out, the right structure for it. When Yale Press finally said, this is interesting enough for us to consider, which I was amazed by. We worked with them to finalize. So it's my life work, and Theology of Making continues in many ways as I paint, as I exhibit, as I work with my fellows to think through these issues.
Wow. I didn't realize all that background about the book. That's really fascinating. I mean, I knew that this book was, really, people were really looking forward to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm grateful for that. Yeah.
So I understand now a little bit more why. So you are kind of in the midst of a shift, and some changes within your own life. You've got a new program starting at Bucknell.
Yes.
Would you like to tell folks about that a
little?
little?
So I've been mentoring younger artists and others that come my way. But, I formalized the program at Photo Seminary when I was asked to give vision to Brehm Center, which I did until January of this year. And then worked with 15 students there. Turned out to be the most diverse group of individuals you ever meet. They're not just visual artists, but they're, entrepreneurs, pastors, fashion designers, and just racially and otherwise very diverse mix of people. Beautiful group of students who now graduated and is doing their own thing. And I continue to mentor them through that process too, because Fujimura Fellows program is not really a program. It's a journey. And, I have so enjoyed getting to know, being able to pass down the value of culture care. We started a podcast called Culture Care Creator Podcast, Light Through the Cracks. We started an academy called Kintsugi Academy together. And so many of those things will continue. I'm recalibrating what I would like to do for the next 10 years. And it really comes down to me wanting to spend time in the studio and then focus on writing. I would like to expand Theology of Making further, the 2/3, which is still there, which I want to really expand. So I figured, I'll focus on that. But meantime, I'm on the board. I serve on the board of Bucknell. I don't have millions of dollars to give away, So what's my contribution? And it occurred to me that, I experienced Bucknell and who I am, especially as an artist and as a writer and as a thinker and as a leader, all these things came out of Bucknell. All the classes that I took, even like animal behavior, social biology classes, they affect my writing today in a very significant way. How can I help journey with undergrads there that are very uniquely positioned? They have liberal arts curriculum, they have School of Engineering and a School of Management. So I'm going to take a sampling of students from each school to just journey through and create hopefully a culture care community at Bucknell. It's an experiment. Who knows? About a year from now, I maybe say, "Oh, it didn't work," so we're not doing it anymore. But it seems like when I posted it on Bucknell's site, 21 students replied immediately, and I was like, "Really? Let me explain what this is. This is not a scholarship. This is not a program. You don't get any credit from this, and they were like, yeah, that's why we're interested.
Wow. Wow. That's very cool. What a response.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you have to worry about the experiment failing from what it sounds like. That's really exciting. And I look forward to, hearing more about that in the future. Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like you've already got a path relative to some of your next book releases then.
Well, who knows, right? I'll certainly work with Kathy to figure out what the next steps are. I think this book has taught me many things already, which I wasn't considering when I wrote it, in that this has a very expansive reach, and talk about education, the effect of thinking this way for education in general, not just Christian education, but liberal arts education, thinking about, business practice that, thinks through on what new creation can mean in road of capitalism. And people have already began to respond in such an interesting way, as well as the theology for pastors who are, trying to figure out how to navigate this time of shutdown and what is the church, moving forward, and what are we supposed to be focused on, when the programming cannot be done, and I think it's a good time to recalibrate everything and think about, what's really important, what endures, what makes us human beings at the deepest level, and how can we honor God with that.
Very cool. Well, we'll look forward to tracking all of this, Mako. As I said, we've known each other for several years and worked together in several ways. And so I'm looking forward to continuing that partnership and collaboration and watching all the things that you spring forth. So
thank you.
Thank you for all of your contributions. And again, the name of the new book is Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. You can order it, pre-order it today and order it tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I think that it's going to be a book that's going to make an impact. And so thank you for that.
Thank you. No, thank you.
So Mako, thanks again for joining us. We're really it's always enjoyable to hear from you and your wisdom and everything that you're doing. So
I appreciate it.